Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone.
Evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
I'm
Hi. It's good to see everyone tonight, or see almost everyone, and look at photos and names of others. That's good. It's good, and we're good on evening, everyone. Great. So we've got YouTube going beautifully. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off in a moment. So I'm going to mute everyone. Don't take it personally. Tonight. Okay. Abba, you can talk and you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm just going to close my door and then we're going to begin. Okay. So this is a bit high. I'm just in a slightly different spot to my normal spot, and it's there we are. Looks like I've got a halo above me, but such is life. So firstly, Ben, you're saying you can't hear. Doron's saying that you can. Ben is saying thanks. Good. All right. So I'm assuming everyone can hear. Just Doron, wave if you can hear me. Good. Thank you, Alexi. Good. Ben, all's good. So we're doing something, well, I wouldn't say it's different to anything that we've done before. It's just that I haven't done this with my father. And we've been toying with this idea for a while of having some schmoozes together. And that's because we're toying with starting a podcast together. And so this is a bit of a test run to see whether we can actually talk when other people are listening in, because normally the only people who listen in on us talking are Emma, Rochel, and the kids. They generally think that we're talking spirit grow stuff, so they just roll their eyes and tune out. But really, we're just reminiscing about our favorite Monty Python episodes, and that's just how we go. But you've got a lovely background where you are, lovely wood paneling.
Thank you.
Imagery that takes me back to childhood.
Yes, it does.
Everything's all right with you guys? Just in case anyone thought that we're sneaking and catching up with each other, this is going to be the first and longest conversation that we've had in quite a while. So how's everything at your end?
Wonderful here. No problems whatsoever.
Okay.
The world is upside down, but we're standing on our feet.
So that's a nice attitude. So I'm just stretching my legs out. But just before we start, I just want to say a special good evening to Charmaine Lewiton. Charmaine, are you there? Are you in South Africa by yourself, or is Ivan with you? I might need to unmute you, Charmaine.
Hi. No, we're here together.
And I know that this really is not necessarily of everyone's interest, but Rochel wanted me to ask you, are you unable to be repatriated back to Australia, or you've opted just to stay put for now?
Well, initially there were a couple of opportunities to be repatriated.
Yeah.
The most desirable one on Qantas right at the beginning.
Yeah.
We didn't get on quickly enough and it was full.
Yeah.
Then on South African Airways, which I was reluctant to go on simply because of being South African Airways in its rather treacherous situation.
Right.
And then I've been all happy to land up in a hotel for 2 weeks, and we decided, to stay. And since then, there are no repatriation flights. And to be honest, we've settled in. Our daughter and family here. That's what we came for. We came for our grandson's bar mitzvah, which regrettably was cancelled. And so we've just stayed on. and waiting to see when it's likely for us to return.
Crazy.
Probably early next year.
And well, if God willing, you might be there for his wedding. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, but I can say what has been very interesting here in Melbourne, and I'm sure it's the case everywhere, is that there have been a lot of local shidduchim. So local boys and girls meeting each other and getting engaged in relatively short amounts of time. And so much so that I know of a couple that got engaged during the first lockdown, and they got married on the last day before this lockdown, when they could still have 10 people, and which was pretty gutsy of them. It definitely sets a precedent, but they've just gone helter-skelter. So, well, we know each other's that well, we've been together for that long, why have a long engagement? So they got engaged and they got married. Anywho, I also want to just say hello to a few. I saw Simon Olensky is here. Is not physically in front of his computer, but there he is. I just want to say hi, Simon. It's actually very special to see you. So I'm gonna come back to chit chat with you, Abba. So there are a few topics that we've got to get through tonight. And the first one that I thought we should talk about is Jonathan Sacks's book, which I have a copy of, and I imagine you've got a copy of. And I know there are a number of Jonathan Sacks fans who are here and also on YouTube, and they've probably got their copies all ready to highlight, hoping for some sort of book review, which this isn't. It's just that I cynically said to you that what I thought this was Jonathan Sacks's his best compilation yet. He had brought from all the best texts, and on the one hand, I found the book to be a particularly brilliant piece of research. The only thing that I felt that I was longing for more was actually his own personal opinion, which I suppose the whole book is his personal opinion, but still I love his personal cases and arguments. But before we get to the actual book, we as a family, without big noting or looking more sophisticated than we already are, we got to spend Pesach with him a number of times in Canada, and you were able to develop a personal relationship. I, being a teenager at the time, just saw him as Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi, but you could actually engage with him for 8-9 days each time, the whole Pesach. What were some of the things that you found particularly impressive and a bit unexpected about his personality and the way he conducts himself?
It was quite fascinating because, of course, I knew of him before we spent those Pesachs together. It was 2 Pesachs, one in Banff, one in Whistler, in beautiful ski country. And, you know, chief rabbi, you sort of expect a person of great charisma and a person who is able to command presence and the like. And the first thing that struck me was his absolute humility. He put on no airs. He didn't in any way seek honors. He was responding to everybody in everyday conversation. He was a very, very fine human being. That was my first impression that I gained from him, and that's never changed since. And then the other one was how much deference he gives to his wife. Jonathan has some ailment in the stomach, and his wife commands literally what he eats and doesn't eat. And you could see when they're seated at the table, Jonathan would look up at Elaine and sort of look at a certain food, and Elaine would say, no, not that one. And he was completely at ease in front of everybody else like that. Also, the third thing, which I found personal empathy, was that he loved solitude. I mean, he was a people's person in the sense that if you approached him, he was very approachable, but he kept running away and finding solitude out there in the snow or out there.
They'd go for their long walks.
long,
together.
long walks. Yes, and it was quite amazing. And the stories that he was able to share with me of behind the scenes stuff in in Buckingham Palace and on royal planes, because he sort of kept company with the prime ministers and also with the Queen and her family. Being the not only was a chief rabbi, he actually was very warmly close with the royal family, specifically the Duke of Edinburgh, and he had a very good working relationship with Prince Charles as well.
Yeah.
And he saw himself also as a very important channel for Jewish values to be able to be shared with people in leadership, specifically with the Prime Minister of England, and he went through a few prime ministers as such. And he was just a terribly impressive individual. One more thing before I ask you to give me your impressions as a youngster of him was as follows. He was probably the only academic that became a chief rabbi or became a rabbi. His true calling is academia. And
Yeah.
currently he's a professor at a couple of universities also, and it shows through his writings clearly. And he also came late into sophisticated Jewish learning, late in life. He didn't have the traditional yeshiva upbringing or anything like that, but he studied so hard later in his teens to be able to catch up, and then in his young adulthood, and he became a Talmudic scholar in his own right. A very accomplished individual. I think a person for the century.
Yeah, he's definitely a unique character because he does have that. He is in many ways head and shoulders above. He does stand out, and his I wouldn't say he's aloof, because aloof has a lot of negative connotations. But on the other hand, he's very approachable and is very real. I mean, did he also spend time with us in Venice? Did he also come to one of the years in Venice?
Not that I recall.
Or Israel? Like, wasn't there? I don't know why I remember that, but maybe not.
Only in Australia.
Oh yeah. When it came to, but no, I thought maybe like there was another Pesach program that we said, but yeah, definitely on his visits to Australia, and I was actually digging around today for the photos of when he came to Spirit Grove, for Shirley. But you asked what I remember. So I loved his drama. You know, he's always like almost like on stage, not in an actor way, but it's like there's a drama to how he speaks. There's a yes, Jonathan, and he could be talking to 5 people, and he does the whole the whole thing, and could be talking to 500 people. He gets very excited with the stories, and but it was very cool. I do remember one of the things that really stuck in my mind was how he completely let his guard down at Sudas Mashiach on the last day of Pesach. Yes. He'd had a few cups of wine, and that was it. He just went storytelling for 2 hours or so, and it was far less messaging and more his personal stories and conversations. And I think because because there was yourself, and then the organizer of the Pesach program, who was Lubavitcher, he shared a number of his personal stories with the Rebbe, particularly when he was a student traveling around America on a Greyhound bus. And he basically credited the Rebbe with being the one that drove him first into rabbinics, and then towards the chief rabbinate. These were, as you said, these weren't things. And I loved how he was the chief rabbi of England, but he was just like schmoozing and completely open. I also remember when I was in Leeds, when I was on Shlichus there, when I was a student rabbi there, and he was doing it was the 50th year, it was some jubilee year of something. I don't know what, but he was moving around the country. Every Shabbos he was spending in a different United Hebrew congregation. And he came, and I was like, oh, I want to go up to him and say, oh, Menachem Wolf, do you remember me? So everyone lined up, and I went up to him. I said, Rabbi Sacks, my name is Menachem Wolf, Label's son. And he goes, "Oh, how's your father's book?" And I was like, "That book's going well. I think it's awesome." It's like, right. And sales are great. Thank you for asking. So it was just a very funny way.
You know where his dramatics comes from.
Yeah.
All the students of Jews College who went through and became reverends and in later years of Jews College rabbis learned the art of public speaking. That was an absolute major subject on their curriculum. Alongside with Talmud and everything else was the art of speaking. Pedagogy was the subject. And they all learned exactly the same kind of skills of how to project, how to wave your arms, and when to lower your voice and when to raise your voice. And he really obviously commanded that gift very, very well.
It's interesting you say it, because that's something that's definitely been lost from the whole smicha curriculum around the world. When I was in South Africa doing smicha, becoming a rabbi, we actually did a public speaking course. And I remember it was a 4-week course, and the first week was just on how to breathe. And a lot of the Americans especially thought this was the most ridiculous thing ever. Like, we're meant to have our nose in the books. And we've got this lady, her name was Ethne, and she's telling us how to pronounce our H's and how to hold our lips, etc. And it was all about that. And I remember we had to present on the 4th week. We had to get up to the pulpit and speak in the shul as if it was full, but it was just her and a video camera. And we had to speak, and then she would sit down with us and critique our presentation while playing it back to us. So that's probably one of the best things I learned in smicha, because I still know how to light a yahrzeit candle, but it's the public speaking that is still most important. So let's get to the book.
Do you remember, just before you go to the book, do you remember at the Sudas Mashiach, amongst the stories, and you mentioned it, when he went traveling on the Greyhound bus, he left England to spend 2 months to explore America by bus. And
that's right. He was traveling around asking every rabbi he met his philosophical questions.
That's right. He decided that the world was his oyster, and he was going to ask all the questions that he needed responding to. And then he must have run into some Chabad shaliach at some Chabad house who said to him, "Look, whilst you're in America, surely you will not miss out on asking the questions of the Lubavitcher Rebbe." And he said that for some reason that wasn't on his agenda. But then when the shaliach mentioned it, he said, "Why not?" And he ended up going to New York and seeking an audience with the Rebbe, and he was granted an audience. Interestingly, others might find this curious, but the Rebbe always granted audiences to non-Hasidim much quicker than to us Hasidim. Everyone else got in line first. We always had to come last. But right. We understand that. That was fine. So he goes into Yechidus, and he's got a number of stories from that audience. But one of them that struck me happened towards the end of the audience. And the Rebbe asked him right at the end, and I think he spent a good hour with the Rebbe, and he was a young student at the time. And the Rebbe asked him, "No, when are you going back to England?" And he said he has to go back because the semester is beginning on such and such a date, which was, like he said, a week later. The Rebbe, without blinking an eyelid, without batting an eyelid, says to him, "No, it doesn't. The semester starts a week later." And Jonathan Sacks was absolutely floored. How does the Lubavitcher Rebbe know when his university starts a week later than what he thought was starting? And that was terribly impressive to him. And the Rebbe said, "Look, if you've got this extra week, why don't you come and study here for a week in yeshiva, in our yeshivas?" And he did. And that led him to later spend a year studying in Kfar Chabad at the Lubavitch Yeshiva early in his rabbinical career, when he moved into rabbinics, etc. But it was just so interesting the way that he shared that little ditty of information.
But, you, of all people, probably shouldn't be that amazed by that story, because your mother, Baba Kinner, has a story, a very similar, even more incredible story with the Rebbe, when she was literally begging the Rebbe to convince Don to go to university. So Don, for those who don't know, is my father's younger brother, And he did not want to go to university. He'd finished school and he wanted to go through a yeshiva system of learning full time. And my grandmother was very into receiving formal education. And she traveled to New York. They were in New York and they met with the Rebbe, your parents. And the Rebbe had a very curious response about his opinions as to why Don shouldn't necessarily, or how he countered Baba Kinner's arguments for why he should go to university. Do you know which story I'm talking about with the statistics?
No,
Oh,
I don't know that story.
so
Baba
Kinner had said that she had another son that went to university, referring to you, and he did law and he's still religious. And the Rebbe actually made a comment that you don't need to tell me how the greatness of my followers of the Chassidim. But then the Rebbe got very serious and turned to Baba Kinner and said, what is so important about him getting a university degree? And she explained why she felt it was important. And then the Rebbe went on to explain that the percentage of students who go to Monash University and Melbourne University who begin the course, he had the statistics of how many actually also finish the course. And then how the percentage of students who go through, I think it was Monash and Deakin or something, how many students finish their course but then go into a career line that actually matches up with the degree. And the Rebbe said the statistics are too low to justify or warrant him wasting his time in university, when in truth, the courses that he does probably statistically don't show that will add to his career at all. This is in the 1960s, I presume. And that your parents were quite flawed how just like that, the Rebbe was able to quote Melbourne City University statistics just like that off the top of his head, which it turned out to be correct. And Don didn't end up going to university, or he did a semester or something.
He did a semester and then he stopped. But you already hinted at, my mother was a very, very outspoken woman. And I suspect that was probably inherited by my son Menachem, because I by nature am obviously not. Am I, Menachem? And therefore
we're going to get to that. There's being extroverted and there's being outspoken. I think we're going to have to get to that this evening.
At any rate, when I finished law school and my studies there, my intention, of course, was to practice law. That was the career path. And the Rebbe asked me if I would take a year off, that was the Rebbe's words, to go and work with university Jewish students. And when my mother heard this, she was terribly upset. And therefore, she and my father decided to go to the Rebbe and give the Rebbe a piece of her mind. Yes. And of course, they trekked off to New York and had yechidus with the Rebbe. And she said forcefully her point of view. And she said some of the similar things that you said about my brother Don. She said, look, he's a lawyer, how much he can do by Kiddush Hashem, by being a religious lawyer, and he can achieve much more that way, etc. And the Rebbe smiled at my mother and said, are you trying to bribe me? And that was his comment to her. And at any rate, she walks out after half an hour with Dad at the Yechidus, and she says, the Rebbe's the most charming individual I've ever met.
Yes.
And she was absolutely okay with what the Rebbe said.
So there's so many stories on that line, which we might just have to open up each time we talk about, because they are classics. But let's go to the book, because I do want to get to this other issue about being outspoken, but one topic at a time. So we've both read the book quite independently, which was interesting, because you thought I'd recommended it. You thought that you recommended it to me, and I thought I'd recommend it to you.
Yes.
And there are some very interesting muzzles that have happened with Jonathan Sacks in this book, because this book was released just before coronavirus was released. And the book is called Morality. And really, at the beginning of coronavirus, once it had left Wuhan, because I remember talking to Spirit about how it had hit 1,000 deaths or 1,000, and like how it's going to become a statistic, and it was just Chinese news. But then it became a global pandemic, and of course there were many moral questions that were starting to be asked about economy versus health, who gets a hospital bed, who gets a ventilator. And so of course the Book of Morality by Jonathan Sacks was a top seller, and then and it actually sold out here in Australia. And then there was the George Floyd killing, and suddenly morality is more in the spotlight than ever before. And the book once again sold out in Australia and around the world. So this has been a very appropriate, well, at least the title is very appropriate. The contents of the book is actually far more than just popular value systems and morals. It actually cuts into, I think it's the first time that I've seen him write in a way that really takes a serious swipe at Western society and Western philosophy. I mean, he's always very into Judeo-Christian values, but this is the first time that he's writing a book and it's like he's giving a serious backhand to society, and not America as such, but society as a whole. What were some of the things that you read that you found particularly engaging and went beyond the lip service of how a society should run?
It's a thick book in the sense of the intensity. Sacks has a very encyclopedic mind, and he draws, as you suggested, from immense number of sources, and seems to be intimate with all the great writings of the world. So it's a very well-rounded book, but not easy reading. Nevertheless, you could see what he's trying to get at. The point, the underlying thesis is that Western society is declining because we have become overemphasizing the individual as opposed to the community, what he calls the I instead of the we. And he traces it back prominently to the 60s and 70s, when the younger people were very disillusioned with leadership at large and turned inward, but turned inward in a way which was almost rejecting the notion of community and neighborliness. It was about personal expression. It was about my life. It was about the self. It was about self-expression, self-esteem. Anything with the word self in front of it began to become prominent. And he said that continued right through into the present tense, and even more so. And he says this is the malaise that we're unfortunately suffering from, because that's the fabric of society is being torn apart, and we're not having that sense of we, of community mindedness, sharing and empathy and compassion for the next person. And he sees that as a very dangerous trend. And I think he's actually a little bit pessimistic about the future.
Surprisingly, he is. Now, I wanted to get your opinion, because growing up, I remember driving to Sydney and to Surface as a family, and we had to listen to the tapes. This is before CDs. Some of the more mature people on this who are listening in will remember this thing called tapes, and you'll probably patronize me and go, well, we remember before tapes. I'm not sure. Portable gramophones in the boot of the car, maybe. Anyway, but I remember we'd listen to tapes, and we grew up listening to things like people like Stephen Covey and stuff like that. And then, of course, at home you had all the shelves of, at the time, the self-help books, and obviously that's something that has somehow influenced. I could lie down on Freud's couch and question why I've got so many books of self-help. Probably either Freud could answer it, or Victorian police could answer it. Well, someone can answer how these self-help books got into my shelf. But you know, having read so many of those books and really taken from their different ideas that you've found particularly valuable and compatible with Chassidus and Jewish spiritual writings in general, do you think it's gone a bit harsh, because it's got a whole chapter on self-help books, and he he really gets stuck into them, that they're not about help, and he actually calls them rather selfish and being part of the problem.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on what he's written there, and is it somewhat damaging? Isn't there merit in a lot of those books? I mean,
Yeah.
we do have this idea of Bishvili Nivra Olam. For me, the world was created. We also have the idea Ani Av Ha'efer, I'm but dust of the earth. But how do we balance this self-esteem, and these books are addressing self? So what's the line, do you think?
I think that the point that's being made is that the techniques, the methodologies can be very, very useful, but they don't direct us to the goal. In other words, the goal, he suggests, is currently limited to the self. Like if someone were to ask me, Label, I want to grow, I want to evolve, I want to become a better meditation practicer, I want to be a fitter individual. I ask them, why are you being so selfish? And they sort of look at me and say, what have I said wrong? I want to grow, I want to evolve, I want to develop. Isn't that a laudable aim? And I say, no, that's very, very selfish. So they ask me, well, what should have been the proper question? So I respond and say, your question should have been, how can I become a better parent, a better spouse, a better citizen, a better friend? What's the difference? The self-help course will still be the medium to evolve, but it's for a goal, and the goal isn't the self. The self isn't the end, but the goal is connectedness to the other. To become a better individual means in context of relationship. And I think that's clearly what the Torah is ultimately saying, that the God-man, God-woman relationship is the model, it's the analog, and we need to express it in the world at large. But I think that what he's correctly stating is that the self-help books stop at the self, unfortunately.
Right, so it's very much becoming an island of perfection on your own.
Very much so. And yes, and you are the ultimate measuring stick by whether you feel that you have lifted more weights, you have meditated an extra 5 minutes, you have been able to do whatever it is, that measurable further level, as opposed to, but what am I meant to do with the gifts and the skills now that I've acquired for my gifts?
That's very interesting, because I've been working through this over the last few days. This idea of that self-development without a greater context, it starts cutting across to some very serious issues, and we'll come back to the book in a sec. But I'll segue into the next point, and we'll come back into the book. This idea of what we're seeing today, is particularly in the last 4 or 5 months. You and I have spoken to many, many people, and we compare conversations. We talk about different people in the community who need support, etc. And for me, a very common reoccurring idea for people who are struggling a lot with the anxiety of reality, and a lot of those anxieties being precipitated by serious issues in their life, whether there are financial pressures, or there are family pressures that are being born out of the difficulties of lockdown and the impact of the coronavirus on the economy. And I was talking to a father who said, here I am, I'm watching trains with my child in the morning. I feel like this is the wrong thing to be doing. I really should be writing emails, but my head's frazzled and I can't look at work right now. And I'm a terrible person because I'm just watching trains. And I brought him the idea from the Gemara, which is actually, what's your work worth if you're not spending time with your kids? Like, well, for what? Like for the European Ashkenazi Caulfield ideal of becoming a successful person and earning a certain amount of money. Although we were talking about how we're always told in our community, family is the most important thing, and you must stick with family. But we also, the subconscious message that we're given by family is the most important thing, but you better have a bloody nice dining room to host your family in. There is this, you've got to get top scores in school, and you've got to get into a top course in university, and you've got to have there is a lot of social pressure on the financial and the status to achieve in life. And I said, I don't know how you're measuring your personal value, but it seems like you're measuring it against these standard values of money, house, status, public perception, when in truth, Torah looks at us in a very different way. And I just don't understand how there can be all this growth without a context in which to grow. At what point does a person say, hang on, I need a context? Just becoming a better version of me is almost like a rat race, because at what point is perfection?
I think that's a very true point. I think that it stems basically from fear, meaning that fear underlies our constant quest for more and more, to shore ourselves up, to face the unknown. So we need to have more assets to secure ourselves. We need more power to withstand the elements. We need just more. And this measurement of more, as you correctly said, has no limits. So the enemy is fear, as not more so than our questing for more and more, because underlying the more and more is fear. So the question is, what are we afraid of? And obviously they're the basic instinctive fears, the fears of survival, which has always been discussed by the psychologists. And we discuss it, of course, at length in Hasidus, except we utilize the word fear in a different context, don't we? We use the word fear in terms of withdrawal. Now, you can withdraw positively, or you can withdraw negatively. You can withdraw from a source of fear, from fire, because you're scared of being burnt. But you can also withdraw from a slanging match verbally, because you realize that you're really creating more harm than good. So that fear can be utilized positively and negatively. And I think that's the wonderful asset that we have in Hasidus, that it provides us with a way of knowing when to limit ourselves in whatever it might need to be limited. Now, take today, going practically, like you said, COVID era. People are scared, but they're scared because they're playing a role called prophet. And I don't mean prophet with an F, but Prophet. They're predicting negativity to the extent of even catastrophic thinking. And because that's what they project in their mind, it becomes their reality. And then they're spending their times running away from reality. So, whilst you have children you can play trains with, at the back of your mind you say, it's COVID and I've got to get this done and I've got to earn more money and I've got to secure myself more, so it conflicts with it. So here's where the this elusive term Emunah comes into the picture. Emunah translates as faith, but it really means to have a positive sense of the future. And because it's a 50-50 probability that tomorrow can be worse or tomorrow can be better, you know, the Premier can get up tomorrow and tell us, oh, your numbers have risen to 600 again, or the numbers have actually fallen to 200. Well, you know, if we play prophet, we can sort of lose ourselves and go to the negative when you've got the same statistical probability of the other. And to be able to be conscious of the possibility of goodness as a result is, I think, what people are missing and lacking, and they're being driven by fear. And I think that's becoming the undoing of families in some instances, and undoing of people in their mental stability in many instances, etc.
The way we're wired, and you know that I like to always draw on evolutionary theory, even though I don't believe in the theory of evolution. But that's our right? As Jews, we can, and you study enough Gemara, you can say something like that. Like, I think it's a brilliant theory. I'm going to use it. I don't believe it at all. But
the scientists have a very good way of getting out of this. They call it neo-Darwinian. So you've got Hasidic neo-Darwinian.
Yes. So in you know, just borrowing from the evolutionary theory where of survival, we're wired to be more afraid than optimistic, because that's ultimately what's going to keep us surviving. You know, if we think every tall, big, drunk person who's yelling anti-Semitic expletives at us is actually just a person who's lost control of their mouth as opposed to anything else, then we're going to get ourselves hurt. But by seeing shadows, it can actually save us. So we're wired to be somewhat fearful naturally. But it's interesting because just as the coronavirus popped up, it literally popped up. It wasn't there, and then it was. Whether it came from a lab or whatever it was, no Joe Schmo was living their life with the expectation that, oh, I better hunker down because next week there's going to be a virus that's going to shut the world down. Most people weren't investing going, well, I'm just going to short things because you never know what could happen next week. Most people were believing that everything's going, and yes, there'll be a financial bubble one day that will burst, but things are going. And then all of a sudden, coronavirus, but the same way it all of a sudden happened negatively, statistically, there's no, and logically, there's no reason to say that something revolutionarily good can't happen tomorrow.
Yes.
But we're just wired to not expect something good.
I think that the wiring begins early in life. I don't think it's natural. I don't think it's within. But, you know, you said it earlier, if parents keep telling kids, you know, you better get the best marks, because if you don't get the best marks, you won't get to the best universities. And if you don't get to the best universities, you're not going to be able to succeed in life. So it's almost as there's a parental and there's an environmental influence of fear that is the motivational push for most people. And we end up being that in our lives. I think it's very, very important to know that parents have to be the source of positivity and actually compensate and allow the home to be the positive environmental processing, because the street will automatically do the opposite. The media will automatically do the opposite. And therefore, if the home can't be a counter influence early in life, then you grow up in fear. I mean, how many very even successful people, wonderfully successful people, if you measure it by financial success, end up on the psychiatrist's couch, figuratively speaking, and feel terribly insecure. I mean, how many people I know, who might be billionaires and at the same time feel absolutely vulnerable to the marketplace, to the point that they're talking like not having a roof over their head if they make the wrong moves. So this is something which is inbred very, very early in our life. And I think it behooves those who recognize that, and especially the home, to be able to provide the alternative. I mean, I know how often parents say to me, I have to teach my kid to be realistic. Well, don't worry. The street will teach your child to be realistic. You have to create for your child a sense of the positivity that is underlying the world as such. And I think that's one of the areas. Can I just say one more thing, Menachem? And I think that's the cause of cancel culture that we're finding currently. In other words,
and he goes into that in the book.
Yeah. You've got to grab on to your view. You're not allowed to let the other person have their view, because you're hanging on to your view like a lifeboat. You can't even allow the other one to speak that view, because somehow you don't want to hear an opposing view, because somehow it'll cause a sense of fear and vulnerability within you. So you wipe it off and you can only listen to your own voice.
Now, just getting something you said earlier about the book, and after this, I want to move on from the book, but you said that that Jonathan Sacks is almost pessimistic about the future. And before we get into our religious and spiritual views of the future and why we're not pessimistic, what is it that he's pessimistic of, and why, philosophically speaking, if there is, and if there isn't, then we have to jump straight into the more religious and spiritual argument. Why, philosophically speaking, would you, or even in context of history, sociologically, would you say there's no need to be as pessimistic as he is? So first, what is the pessimism, in your opinion, that he's expressing? Because he does have a fear around where democracy is going.
Yes.
He makes that very clear.
Look, I think he's being very, very clever in the book. It's a book about morality, and yet I think he shirks the question as to what is right and what is wrong. He says that morality historically and in society is relativistic. In other words, it keeps changing according to the common vantage point of the culture at the time and keeps shifting. And he says the saving point of Western democracy is that it's based on a Judeo-Christian set of values. He doesn't go to the next step explicitly, although he's not shy of talking Torah and talking God in the book. He's actually very strong in that regard, and he sees that as the saving point, and that's going to be part of my response to you. But what he does not go is to the area of discussing as to, well, okay, if we've got a relativistic sense of morality and good and bad keeps changing, well, what really is it? And he doesn't really stop there. His saving point is that religion is the only source of absolute morality, of absolute values. And here I'm interpreting, he doesn't say this, it's coincidental that the Judeo-Christian culture is based on the Torah. And therefore, what is good coincidentally happens to be the value system of the West. And that's why there may be room for optimism, because that is the case. And in those areas where it's not so, he feels that the secular processes that define how community is to be run hasn't got any measuring stick and doesn't have any compass bearing.
A couple of years ago, when we did Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the St Kilda Town Hall, I actually spoke about the rise of religion and the rise of philosophy in context of artificial intelligence, because I felt that how can society, moving down the path of artificial intelligence, how could it really progress without some sort of higher authority, a value system that is greater than humankind? Because we're going to have to program computers to make decisions, or give computers the freedom to keep developing their own algorithmic development. But as the creator, what gives us the right to do that? And how do we program the driverless car? The classic example of, does the driverless car kill the pedestrian or its passengers if it's going to be in such a situation? And man has to program the car. And you can't make silly excuses like, oh, we'll do it in a way that it's inevitable. Like, realistically, what are you going to do? And suddenly with that rise of technology, there must be a rise of philosophy and religion. And now what you're saying is that
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Well, we'd hope so. I mean,
I'm not confident.
I mean, maybe democracy too will run its course. I mean, nothing has lasted. You know, there might be a new iteration. We talk about COVID being this once in a century thing. Who knows what other once in a lifetime things? This might be. Revolutions do happen overnight. Empires fall slowly, but new ones spring up fairly quickly.
Yes.
Who knows? And I'm not advocating for anything old. In fact, I'll tell you two interesting things. I just finished on Shabbos the book Professor Philip Wexler wrote. It's called Social Vision. And it's his analysis of the Rebbe's vision of society, broader society, not just Jewish community. And it's interesting because the Rebbe was probably the only Orthodox leader of the 20th century who had any vision for the world, a genuine vision, as well as a plan of how to deliver on that vision that went beyond Jewish people. So two things that we were just talking about that remind me of the book is number one was I can't remember number one, but get to number two was the Rebbe, as we know, was very, very in favor of prayer in public schools in America, because he felt that one of the underlying problems in America was the lack of existing under something greater than self, and that we exist in a greater context, and also the idea of pausing and reflecting on the value of life. He saw that as being far more serious than anything else, and he actually attributed crime rates and all sorts of things to that. He also had, I just read a chapter, it was fascinating, on the Rebbe's view on prison, The Rebbe was very left-wing when it came to to prison reform, and drove a prison reform agenda through the Senate. And in fact, there's a judge who he collaborated with who's 96, and he still is notoriously alternative when sentencing criminals in New York. But something that the Rebbe wrote was that someone wrote how these are Judeo-Christian values, and therefore America should respect it. And the Rebbe said, why limit it there? Why not call them Judeo-Christian Muslim values and build a coalition across all faiths to drive this through Congress? And he was extremely open-minded to finding commonality with other religions for the sake of a greater good in society, while at the same time not at all allowing that into Jewish community and education. He was quite right-wing when it came to Jewish education, but quite left-wing when it came to a broader social vision. And I just found that interesting because Jonathan Sacks does constantly refer to Judeo-Christian, and the Rebbe said, let's try to find commonality with the Muslim community because we'll be able to drive a more powerful agenda that way, which is not something that we necessarily do as Jewish people. We don't offer, I mean, interfaith people do, and people who want to show that we're all equal do, but to drive a religious agenda and partner is not something that's done. I mean, in a way, shchita, the kosher killing of animals in Australia is protected only because of halal. I mean, we number 100,000 in the country, and how many Jews dafka want shchita meat? It's because of the Muslim community that halal is not tampered with in Parliament. And likewise, bris, circumcision, again, the Muslims are a much larger minority than we are, and they're protecting circumcision in this country. And it's the Catholics who allow rabbis to be paid with fringe benefits. No one's going to start with the method of paying Catholic priests or Anglican priests. So we're very much riding on the coattails of other religious minorities in this country. And we should probably think about that from a more pragmatic than any other. I want to launch off something that he talks about in the book to maybe just pick up an issue that you and I argue over, and sometimes quite passionately. So he talks about victimhood in the book. He's got a chapter on victimhood. Let's just touch on what is his view on how victimhood is being used in today's society, and what his position is on victimhood, because it's quite an important subject. Where does one draw the line between compassion and whatever it is that's on the other side of that line?
Yes, and actually he quotes quite extensively from another book when discussing that, and that is the book called The Choice by, I think it was Eva Eger, I think the name is. And the book, The Choice, she wrote as an autobiographical work based on her survival of 4 years in concentration camps. And then she went on to the United States and became a very noted clinical psychologist and got a PhD eventually. And she writes in the vein of Viktor Frankl. In fact, she communicated and met several times with Viktor Frankl and adopted very much Viktor Frankl's position. So victimhood, she has a very fine, he quotes a very fine quote, and that is something along the lines that there's victimization and there's victimhood. Victimization is what the other person tries to do to you. Victimhood is what you decide to acquiesce to that. You can choose to practice victimhood, or you can choose not. Other people can victimize you as much as they want, but you are the one who's responsible for your victim thinking or otherwise. And she said, like Viktor Frankl said, they cannot take away my freedom to choose my mental response to the circumstances. And clearly Sacks echoes very strongly both Frankl and Eger in this respect. Victimization comes from the outside, victimhood comes from the inside. And therefore, it's a very, very worthy consideration. You choose whether you're a victim, because how many people today, Menachem, keep coming to you and to me and say, "Oh, look what they're doing to me. Look what he's doing to me. Look what she's doing to me. I'm being emotionally assaulted, etc., etc." And I keep saying there's no such thing as emotional assault. And they get very, very upset with me because everyone has to agree there's such a thing as emotional assault. But what I'm saying is that emotional assault is the victimizer. Whether you choose to be a victim is how you respond to the circumstances.
Now,
in your mind and action.
Now, this is a very interesting topic because, and I'm sure many people know, we put out our own original memes a few times a week. And you recently designed a meme around this idea of victimhood. And Rochel saw pop up on the Spirit Grove Facebook page, and we were discussing it because we often discuss, and then you and I discuss, and the family will discuss whether you can say these things in short, or whether they can only be said in this context where there's the opportunity to explain. So a number of times you've written blogs and I've said we just can't publish that. We can't let that go. And
Menachem, everybody, is my censor, by the way.
So for those of you who haven't worked it out, my father is very, very capable of analyzing a situation and looking at it and seeing the threads of logic or the lack thereof, and is very, very good at then taking those threads and putting them in your hand and saying, here you are, here's the problem, here's the solution. Is there anything left to this discussion? If not, I'll go back to typing on my keyboard. I tend to bring out a big box of tissues and have a good cry. And yet people say, Menachem, what a wonderful, wise person you are, and people say about you, what a wonderful, wise person you are, and we can't both be wise, surely. I mean, we know full well there's only one of us who could. But what's interesting is you're very into, when writing, and sometimes I've just had to defer to you, and sometimes you'll take my opinion on board and defer. But I find that it's quite in today's world, particularly in the world of social media. So academic articles published on academic sites, or long-winded comments like we're making here, is one thing. But writing short pieces about victimhood, one paragraphs on Facebook or 140 characters on Twitter, or a short video in 60 seconds, do you really think we can communicate these messages? A lot of people take offense to them. Going back to the self-help books that we were talking about, people read these self-help books, and they are very good books in of themselves to a degree. There are problems, but because that is where people are at and don't necessarily have this deeper philosophical idea of victimhood being what you adopt, do you think we can really, you obviously do, but do you really, why do you think, I should say, because you do believe it, why do you think we can write these truths if they are so offensive? Is it worth sharing a truth that's going to rub everyone the wrong way, and then they're going to stop listening to other messages? Or do you feel, and sometimes I feel you do, that we must be the flag bearer of a truth irrespective of whether it's going to hurt or not? Why do you feel that it's okay and probably the right thing to turn complex ideas like victimhood into a meme if so many people do get upset? And I'm not one, I just want to clarify, I'm not one to say people's emotions should govern what we do and don't say. I'm talking about complex ideas that cut to the core. Many people are defined by their negative experiences, particularly abuse or other things, and it does hurt them. So are we actually achieving anything good by doing this?
I suppose one asks the question, what's the function and purpose of a meme as opposed to an essay and as opposed to a book? And I've taken the approach that the function of a meme is to open the mind and to challenge, not always, but sometimes the meme should challenge a person's normative way of thinking. I think that those people, for example, those people who are highly committed to a feeling of being a victim will always come out and feel very, very upset, whether you say it in 3 words, or whether you say it in 30 words, or whether you even say it in a book. Because I think it goes much deeper than simply reading another point of view. That requires probably therapeutic approach. It requires a consideration of background. It requires them to have a process of analysis. But if we were fearful of putting down pithy statements because it's going to offend, then I'm not sure that there's anything we can write, because ultimately everything that I write or you write or anyone writes is a point of view, which either we've adopted or created, and it will offend somebody. But if a person takes offense, I personally believe they have a problem. If a person says, I don't agree because, that I understand. So I guess in my state of life at my age of 73, I guess I'm not being as sensitive to people who might oppose that vantage point ab initio, and I just put it down because I think it's important to awaken people or to reinforce people's points of view.
Yeah, it's interesting what you just said. That role of awakening people. It's only the last few years that I've realized that there are different types of rabbis. You have teachers, and you have this. It's not just in rabbinics. You have it everywhere. But you have teachers, and you have people who they're there to work almost in isolation. They're there to put ideas out there, not necessarily to be popular. They don't play a political game. Sometimes you have to play the political game because there's a different agenda. And you look particularly in the period of Rome and the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah. You find many different positions. Some which say just work with Rome and don't upset them because there's another agenda here of where we can still hold on to the temple, and others who are like, no, we don't need a temple if it's going to come at the cost of having to appease Rome. And we've got to be very clear with our messaging, and we can't allow for any dilution. And they almost were standard bearers, like these things have to be said, and if we die saying them, let that be the case, so that the generations in the future remember. And others were like, well, there won't be generations in the future if you keep doing these things. They're going to kill us all off. So there are different roles to play, and actually the Gemara says that both positions are right. You actually need both sides because they're both required.
But so Menachem, I'm very happy for you to rein me in. That's fine.
I might just be in charge of social media, and you can write the books.
Okay.
I'll promote your books. I'm just not going to tell anyone what's in them. No, but then on the other hand, I do have to say, if there's one thing that I have learned from you in context of putting opinions out there, it is to also be very, don't write something. If there's one thing that I've had to turn on, it's I won't write something if it's incorrect. But you are a person who's quite principled, and if you believe it to be correct, you're not going to be scared of the truth. You're not going to be scared of putting it out there. So I have learned that don't worry about the popularity, just focus on whether it's correct or not. Don't worry about the likes. If it needs to be said, then it needs to be said. Anyway, there's so much more that we could talk about. And as I put out on WhatsApp, this was a bit of a sample run to see whether we could start a podcast. In your opinion, do you think there's podcasting energy between us?
Oh, that's definitely. There's no question about it.
Oh,
The problem is we've been on our best behavior today. Let them see us when it's really like it is.
I know they're probably going to think like I'm some sort of son that needs the. I was of course we're going to do the podcast. I just need the permission of my father, but I'd like to hear before we finish. I'd like, if anyone does have any questions on some of the things that we've discussed, I think it'd be very worthwhile to join in the schmooze. And of course, if you want to send us feedback about about the style, about the things we discussed, and anything, because I do want to move this along into something a bit more formal, like or something more serious and well better developed, like a podcast. But this is father and son. Any questions before we sign off? I'll just check Facebook, because I did notice Hannah was writing furiously on she was really having to say all sorts of things, on YouTube. Sorry, not on Facebook. On YouTube, we've got a massive following. We've got 14,500 people. So you get all sorts of interesting characters. But most of all, we've had lovely comments. Nothing about what about Satan and the gematria, all those oddballs.
Have you got people on mute, by the way?
Everyone's on mute. Everyone's on mute.
Unmute them so they can yell at
I'm gonna unmute, but I'm first gonna say goodnight to YouTube, because the conversation on Zoom is very much an internal one. So I'll say goodnight, YouTube, and thank you for joining. And